Hi, this is Phoebe Blamey and welcome to the Happy Money Journey podcast for today. I'm really excited to have you here. I have spent most of my life working in financial services. I'm a qualified financial planner and I have my own mortgage broking business since 2006. I know that as a busy woman, it's really hard to get your life into some sort of shape. And so I'm here to help you on your own happy money journey. And here we are for our first live interview at the Happy Money Journey podcast with the amazing, brilliant Eloise Tomkins, who is a trained psychologist. She's left that business now to start her own therapy business to help us get out of our own way. And I'll let you tell us a little bit about you.
Thanks for the warm welcome. It's so wonderful to be here and so wonderful to be here live in person as well. So like you said, I have been trained as a psychologist, but I've moved over to the coaching space and there's, so many reasons that I could unpack as to why I did that. And I think one of the reasons that I moved across to the coaching space is because what I was seeing is women in business who were, like you said, kind of stuck in their own way, holding themselves back. And I knew that there was something that I could offer in that space to help women build a business that they love, build a business that they can thrive in. But what I was also finding is that some of their limiting beliefs and some of their subconscious blocks were in fact getting in their way of them being able to achieve their goals. So I decided to bring my skill set, my passions together, and build a business helping other women.
That's fantastic. So you trained as a psychologist first. Mm-hmm. How long were you working as a psychologist?
So I've been in the psychology space for around a decade. Mm-hmm. Probably even longer. Which was incredible. And it was a really long journey to, I guess, get to psychology because it's a degree that takes 6 years to kind of learn and to skill up in. So I've been in that space for quite a while.
Mm. And then, so moving to coaching, what qualifications did you do? What did you do to move to coaching?
So I haven't done any formal coaching qualifications. I think for me, one of the reasons that I wanted to move from psychology to kind of the coaching umbrella is psychology is a heavily regulated industry, which is so needed when you're working with people who are experiencing mental health, because to help people with mental health, there are evidence-based treatments that you deliver. So if you have anxiety, for example, we know that exposure can be something to help people with anxiety. There's kind of really strong structures in place, whereas what I was also finding is that all of these rules and regulations meant that I couldn't bring myself and my personality into coaching. I couldn't be here doing this podcast with you, for example. And so the regulating body, AHPRA, would kind of really crack down and have all of these heavy rules. And as a person who rebels and doesn't really like a lot of rules and wants to do their own thing, I felt really restricted by that. And so the coaching industry, on the flip side, actually doesn't have a lot of regulation associated with it. So that's probably at the other extreme of things, which is at a disadvantage as well, because I think there does need to be some regulation there, but that's a whole separate topic. So I guess I moved across to coaching because it did have that flexibility where I could do things a little bit more creatively, offer things in a way that was more creative for people, where I could be myself, where I didn't have to worry so much about all of the rules and trying to conform to be this psychologist that I had to be.
That makes a lot of sense. I found that with the greater restriction as the financial services businesses that I'd been in previous to doing this had got more and more and more regulated. We see more and more people exit because it's not quite what they got in there for in the first place. They got in there to help people, to make people's lives better. The the greater the regulation, the more difficult it is to really put your own brand on stuff. So as part of your coaching, you now specialise in EMDR. Can you tell me what that is?
Yeah, oh my goodness. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a backstory here. So EMDR, oh my gosh. EMDR stands for, are you ready? Eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. I swear to God, the lady who came up with this name, bless her, she came up with a really, really great coaching tool. But at the same time, the name for it is just such a mouthful, and people kind of look at me and go, what the heck is that? EMDR was developed back in the 1980s by someone named Francine Shapiro, and she actually discovered it when she was going on a walk and noticed that as she was walking and she was thinking about something upsetting, and she found her eyes kind of flicking back and forth. And what she then noticed about her memories is that they kind of were starting to get less distressing and felt a bit more neutral. And she was like, oh, that's interesting. So off she went and she did a little bit of self-testing to see what was happening with the eye movements. And what she essentially discovered is that when we have experienced a traumatic memory, and I use the word traumatic very loosely because I think sometimes people think of trauma as this huge, gigantic thing that's happened in our life, and it can just be something small that our body hasn't had the opportunity to process for whatever reason. And EMDR kind of helps us to process that memory by facilitating REM sleep, and it helps alleviate that kind of distressing memory and move it into the past where it needs to be.
And so you can't practice that as a psychologist, or you need, and that's why you needed to do the coaching?
So this is where it's a really unique skill set that I bring to the coaching industry, because to practice EMDR, you need to be qualified or trained in particular areas, so counselling, social work, as a psychologist, as a nurse, some kind of allied health professional. So you definitely do need to have some backing behind you.
Yeah.
And traditionally EMDR has been used in the therapy space. So it has been used to treat conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder. It has been used to help people with anxiety or depression or other mental health related conditions. What we have found over the years, though, is that EMDR is not just something that can treat mental health, but it can be used to enhance performance. And this is kind of where
cushion drop.
This is where I absolutely love EMDR and where I found a real passion for it, because I worked with a whole bunch of clients in the trauma space, and there were just such rapid shifts really, really quickly. People who have had long-standing trauma, I know you can relate to this.
I can so relate to this. I'll tell you my story in a minute, guys.
The people who had long-standing trauma, and we did a couple of sessions, like maybe 3 sessions of EMDR, and the shifts were just profound. And I was like, oh my goodness, like this is amazing in the trauma space. And I'm kind of going off on a bit of an adjunct here, but I was getting burnt out as a psychologist, and I was also, talking about money on your podcast as well. I also have this passion with financial independence and wealth, particularly for women, because I think that women inherently don't earn as much as men. Women inherently don't reach, like in their own business, don't turn over 7 figures or more. So my passion then became about, well, how can I help women reach those goals? And what can I do? How can I use my skill set to help them? And so EMDR then became a part of that, because I love how fast it works. I love how transformative it is. I love how quickly it unblocks the things that are holding us back. And so what I started doing was investigating performance EMDR. And I realized it's been used for elite athletes and to help them with their performance. It's been used in the executive space with CEOs and people in corporate. And I thought, I wonder if this would help women in business because, you know, me being in business myself and whatnot, I thought, let's play around with this. And I started bringing this into women in business and seeing these incredible results with EMDR. So it's no longer for me operating it out of a trauma context. It's more kind of operating with a performance context in terms of there's some kind of a block that you're having in your business. You aren't able to be visible. You're not showing up on socials. You have a fear of having difficult conversations with your team. I know you're nodding along because you're like, yes,
I know this. I've got so many stories to tell in a minute.
And then I love being able to kind of come in and do this rapid intensive EMDR and then boop, those blocks are gone. So I personally find it really rewarding and really fun, and I love being able to use it in a non-trauma context and offer this skill set in a very different way.
So, full disclosure here now, guys. If you haven't heard the interview that I've done with Eloise yet, on her podcast, do have a listen. It digs deep into the actual process of my own EMDR therapy. I did this with Eloise in January of this year. It was life-changing for me, and it was... The thing that I was finding the hardest, I think, is the showing up and the taking up more space and the getting out onto socials and doing stuff, you know, improving the podcast, getting stuff released. It's almost, and last week we spoke about procrastination on the podcast, but it's almost the tool that helped me get through a lot of that sort of stuff and move myself forward. But the side effects have been magnificent as well, because things like I was so angry with my mother and that has now gone. I have such a different attitude to a whole lot of things. One of my friends who I see every fortnight for a coffee just says to me, you're just so much more grounded now. You've lost the flighty kind of tenseness that you were walking around with, which I didn't even realise, but does explain an awful lot about my family, actually, now that I come to think of it. But really, it is transformative, and not just my word for it. There's an excellent interview with Sandra Bullock, who talks about her experiences with it. She's interviewed by Jada Pinkett Smith and Willow Smith, and she's just such a raving fan of it. So if you're thinking of doing something like this, there was a lot of work I'd done first. There was a whole lot of other stuff that I'd been kind of exploring and putting my mind to. We've just run out of battery. Just breathe.
Just think though, what I'm super curious about is what would previous Phoebe, prior to EMDR, how would previous Phoebe have responded to this hiccup?
I would have been really angry, actually. Angry was like my go-to. I liked angry. Angry, like, you know, just set some stuff on fire, just stomp around and, you know, why can't this be right? And that very masculine energy that you get from anger, which I think is also part of when you work in corporate with a whole lot of men, you take on that trait very much, and you make your feminine very dormant. You really take on those very masculine, the way you walk, the way you dress, the way you move, the way you speak becomes very masculine, and I think that you get that anger energy that comes with that.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
How men can have that angry. And obviously, not all men. Hashtag not all men.
Not all men.
Not all men.
Not all men.
Before you come at us. But it's true, isn't it? Like, it's interesting. And I was talking to a friend about this yesterday, how energy kind of comes together. And, you know, it's kind of what you were saying earlier as well, how you have done so much work prior to doing your own EMDR. And there's so much importance in that, in terms of bringing that self-awareness, bringing that understanding of yourself, bringing that kind of readiness, because I think EMDR is very much that, for me, the way I see it is kind of this piece that has been missing for people. Yeah. And I know that's kind of something we had...
I would agree with that. I think that's the absolute best way to describe it. And Sandra Bullock describes it when she's talking to the Smiths about it as just... you know, she's got this visual of herself in a cupboard. It's such a horrible story. And she doesn't want to carry that through to motherhood, is why she wants to change. And she talks about how all of a sudden it's just gone. And that's the weird thing about it. It's not like when you do other forms of therapy, when you do, say, cognitive behavioural therapy or you're doing just talk therapy or anything like that, it's a journey. But with EMDR, because I did it in that weekend, it was just instant. It was just like instant coffee without the bitter aftertaste. It was quite wonderful.
I love that. I love that so much. And that's what I love about EMDR is because what I often find is that people will kind of come to me and they'll be like, I've tried all of the things. I've tried therapy. I have done the business coaching. Like, I've got skills up the wazoo and I know what I'm doing and I know what I need to be doing to get my business to that next level. I've read the self-help books. I've done hypnosis. I've done spiritual healing and crystals and tried to unblock my chakras. And I'm still feeling internally that there's something. I can't quite put my finger necessarily on it, but there's something.
Yeah.
And EMDR is just powerful. Like I remember a client sort of saying to me after we'd done EMDR and they had this block, and this was kind of working in a trauma space, and it was quite a significant trauma that they went through. And we did an EMDR, and they were just like, "You're magic. What happened?
You're magic."
And I was like, I'm not a magician. I just have the skills to be able to help unblock, to help your brain reprogram itself so that memory is no longer like front of mind. Because it's kind of like, if you imagine almost like, I've got this jacket on, for those of you listening via audio, I've got a jacket on, but imagine underneath my jacket, I've got a bruise that you can't see. And people keep pushing up against the bruise. They keep rubbing up against the bruise as they walk past, and they don't know the bruise is there. But every time they hit the bruise, you're like, ow! And the bruise can't heal because you're constantly hitting it. People are constantly hitting it.
Yeah.
But if you are able to kind of take some space and let that bruise heal, or get like the space to remove that bruise, then it's not going to get irritated. And that's kind of going to be there. You're always going to have had the bruise. It's always going to be, a part of your story, but it won't be so impactful day to day.
And that was the thing that I found really with it, and particularly around that relationship with my mother. That's just freaked me out beyond belief. Because my journal before and then my journal after, she comes down to stay with me for 3 days with pretty much the clothes on her back, which would normally irritate me just because it's irritating. And she's come down, and even though there were fires and her house was about to burn down, it's, all the things. But because I was so angry with her, I could never have the empathy. You know what I mean? And obviously I'd do all the things to be the nice, caring daughter and look after her and all of those sort of things. But at the end of the day, I'd be just seething with anger that, I was in this position. She came down. I was like, fine, come out. I'm going down to see some of my friends at the pub. Come down with me. Come here, come there. Let's do this. Let's enjoy each other's time together. I cannot tell you the contrast. So that was in February, and she'd been away with us in January for over Christmas, and I can show you in my journal. It's just like, fuck.
And it's interesting, because the thing is, and I love that kind of reflection, because when women come to me, it's because there's something going on in their business. They're not showing up on socials. They're finding that they're stuck at this plateau in terms of their income, or they've got this idea that they're wanting to implement. I've got a client at the moment. She's like, oh my goodness, I've got this business idea that I want to execute, but I can't. I need to unblock something. And so we're working through that. And what I find fascinating is the impacts are not just for your business. They are, like, you absolutely see it in your business, but then it infiltrates every other area of your life as well, because like you said before, it can make you more grounded, it can make you calmer, more confident, less reactive, less angry, less defensive. And I mean, who wouldn't want to be?
Who wouldn't want to be that? And I've been that for years. Like, I've been going on that low level anger kind of defensive, aggressive kind of for years and years and years and years, and it's exhausting. Like, it depletes you constantly, and also because you're in that hiding of emotions and burying things. You're burying it with food, you're burying it with alcohol, you're burying it with overspending, and we've talked about these things in the podcast in the past. But it kind of, it's like a new broom. It's like you get down to that core essential part of yourself, which you know, coincides with me, you know, getting into my 50s and doing all those things. But so you get into that kind of different headspace, and it just changes everything. I'm such a big fan of it. If you were to give people, where do people need to be when they come to you for EMDR? Where do they need to be? What's your ideal, like, is it their first therapy that they've ever done? Is it the last therapy that they'll ever do? Like, where are we?
Oh, I love that question. That's such a great question. And it's so interesting because I can pick who's ready for EMDR compared to somebody who's not. So I love that question so much. And I think that somebody who is ready for EMDR is somebody who, in my opinion, has done the therapy before. They know themselves. They have tried the things, and yet there's still something that's kind of missing, and they can kind of feel that inner shift. So they might know what their beliefs are. They might logically know. They might go, oh, I know that I have this belief that comes up that I'm a failure, that I'm not good enough, that I'm not worthy. And I know that it comes from the stories that I've got with my mum growing up when I was a child. But they still have this sense that they just don't feel good enough. They don't feel worthy. So having that awareness, I think, is key, because I think that if you're coming to EMDR without kind of that self-awareness, then you're going to have to build up to that. And interestingly, if we think about EMDR from a therapy perspective, not a coaching perspective, there's actually 8 phases to EMDR, which sounds like a lot, but EMDR, when people hear EMDR, people often think about it as the finger waggling or the eye movement or bilateral stimulation, which is the processing of the memories, but that's only one part of it. The first 4 parts of EMDR is actually really setting you up to do the finger waggling or the bilateral stimulation part. And so technically you can, if you were doing EMDR therapy, you could start at any point, but you might not get to that finger waggling part until, you know, a number of months or maybe years down the track. With the coaching framework that I use personally, though, with my 6-week intensive, I'm looking for people who have already done some of that work already, but are needing that missing piece to kind of fill the gap that they haven't been able to achieve with other types of coaching or therapy or self-help before.
It's good. Let's just take a moment, though, to explain the finger waggling and the thing. So basically, when I did EMDR with you, it was dots across the screen, but there's a number of different ways you can do it, isn't there?
Yeah. So again, when we talk about EMDR, often people think about the eye movements or the processing part, which is neutralizing those distressing memories. So there are a number of ways that can be done. So the way that Phoebe and I did it was through dots across the screen, which was essentially saving my fingers from moving across the screen, because I think we did 3-hour sessions, if I remember correctly.
It was intensive.
It was intensive. I've since changed the program, actually, because I was like, that's a lot of time for someone to commit. So we've spread it out a little bit over a 6-week period rather than a week. But
it's a lot of energy for you to have, though, too, because you've got to really bring it for that. So we started on a Thursday night, and did the pre-work, and then we went into 2 very intensive sessions on the Saturday and the Sunday morning. So there's a small gap between, and you kind of not knowing what to expect. But I kind of did, because me being me, I'd looked into things, I'd done a little bit of research, I'd Googled a few things, I'd found out about it. And the other thing that I do, which a friend of mine got me into, is the tapping. So it's that similar kind of thing of reprogramming yourself by doing something physical. And I don't know if you...
I don't know too much about EFT. It's not something I'm trained in.
It's basically just you
tap different
pressure points in your body, and you say phrases that you believe, and then you change them to phrases that you don't believe. It's kind of like, just tapping. And
you can do that with EMDR. Like, I think EMDR is, so I don't know too much about emotional freedom techniques or tapping, but with EMDR, the aim is that we want to activate both parts of the brain at the same time. We want to bring your upsetting memory into your working memory, so out of your limbic system into your working memory, so that we can then process that and move it into your long-term memory. And we do that by activating both parts of the brain, and we do that by tapping. So tapping kind of facilitates both parts of your brain being engaged.
Yep.
The research has shown that, or I guess the early research showed that eye movements was a really fast and effective way to do that, but we've since kind of discovered other ways. So things like butterfly hugs can be really helpful to do that, because you're activating both sides of the brain. I've done it like this, just by tapping on my knees, alternating tapping. And, you know, sometimes we'll get people to tap their feet, alternating as well. And the idea is basically we just want to really work your working memory so that it can move that upsetting memory into the past. So
that we can fully heal. The women who's Emily and I can't remember her last name, wrote Burnout. It's an excellent book, and it's about burnout. And one of the things that she describes is that we don't get to the end of a cycle. So when we have a trauma, we don't... So imagine the kind of primitive brain being chased by a lion. We get chased by the lion either catches us or we kill the lion, but the story ends. But when we have trauma, we get to that point where we kind of process but don't process. We don't finish the story, and that's often why trauma lies within us. And again, by trauma, I don't mean necessarily something dreadful that's happened, but it could be a small thing. It could be something as simple as your parents picked you up late from school and you suddenly feel abandoned. It's not necessarily something huge.
Absolutely. And and that's such a good point, because I think we use the term, and maybe this is my own assumption, but I feel like we use the term trauma to reflect something big that's happened. And it doesn't have to be that way. It can be. Absolutely. A trauma can be a car accident. It can be a sexual assault. Absolutely. But it can also be, like you said, your parents not picking you up from school when they said that they were going to. And as a child, you know, you don't have the brain functioning to kind of problem solve and to be able to think, oh, maybe they're running late, or, oh, maybe they forgot, or whatever. Our brain automatically goes, oh my goodness, this is a threat to my survival, because if you're a child and you don't have an adult to take care of you, you're going to die.
Yes.
Right? So it becomes a survival thing. And our brain then does what it does. It's kind of like, there's a threat to my survival. I feel fear. And when we feel fear and it's operating in our body for too much, too far, too long, then we can't, like you said, process that. It doesn't integrate. And if we have a multitude of those experiences, which we do, we all have them, whatever they look like, they can be different for all of us, but we all have them. And sometimes they just get stuck in our body. They get trapped in our body. And I think that's the missing piece, is that people, particularly business owners, we are very rational people and we want to problem solve. And I think this is one of the other things for people who come to me. They're like, I've done all of the rationalizing, Ellie. I've thought my way through this problem and I'm still here. I have thought my way through it. Maybe it's time that I need to look inwards and I need to actually process my feelings. And I'm like, process your what? And they're like, feelings. Because we don't like doing it, right?
We don't like doing it. Why would we like doing it? It's awkward and uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And icky and...
But I think we get to a point where we're like, okay, well, you know what? I've tried everything else and I've avoided this thing for the longest time. And the thing with EMDR is that, you know, you don't even need to like talk about it necessarily to process it. It just needs to be in your mind. And that's kind of what I love about it as well, because it's not, a lot of people kind of, like you said, don't know what to expect in an EMDR session. And it's so different from other coaching because it's not talk-based. While we're kind of doing the understanding and unpacking your beliefs, it is, and that's what my first couple of sessions certainly are, is what are your subconscious blocks? What is getting in your way? And then we look at, you might want to talk to this in a moment because I know your experience with this was fun. But then we sort of look at the parts of yourself that are blocking you from accessing some of those emotions. And so we do a bit of talking in those steps. But then ultimately what EMDR really is hands off. Like, it's not talk-based. You're not sitting there rationalizing, well, when I was 5, my parents forgot to pick me up at school and yeah, that made me feel really sad. And, oh, that's probably why now when I have a team member in my company and they're running late for work, I'm automatically thinking that they're going to quit because of that experience. We can rationalize it, but we haven't actually dealt with the fear that you felt when you were a little 5-year-old that was abandoned by their parents, right?
Yeah.
So that's what we use EMDR to kind of go back to, is to kind of reprocess that fear that we had in that moment.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. My name is Hannah and I am the producer of this podcast, along with Joshua Dean Graham. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we live and work, and pay our respects to the ancestors and elders, past, present and emerging. We are grateful and honoured to live on this land and pay homage to the traditions of storytelling, communities and the connection to land. Thank you for listening to our podcast.
Disclaimer. Just a reminder that the advice that's contained in this podcast is general in nature. It doesn't take into account your individual needs and circumstances, and we recommend considering the appropriateness of any advice to your individual circumstances and needs. We always recommend seeking the advice of an expert before making any financial decisions.